My name is Michael Brockbank, and I began with SACC in 1975. The group had just started, and I was interested in promoting a game that I was interested in, a Japanese board game by the name of Go. And I thought, oh, a public access channel would be interesting. The idea was out there that people could make tapes and have them played at no cost. And I thought, okay, this might be a way to publicize this particular game. So I went to a meeting of SACC, and lo and behold, it turned out that SACC at that time was in a birthing turmoil, and people were being overridden. There was a strong personality who had anointed herself as the chairman, and a lot of people in the organization were unhappy about that there was no organization, that the president kept saying that the president had the power to do this and power to do that. And so when they found out that I was a newly minted lawyer, they asked for help. And so that's how I got involved with the organization of SACC. We ended up writing bylaws. We ended up, tossing the self-anointed chairman out of office. We elected people, established a board of directors, elected officers, and that was my involvement with SACC. And I stayed involved for about 15 years. At one point, I had a show where I was the host of a show called Electric City Forum, and we did a lot of shows, a lot of interview shows. But in those days, it was black and white. And you have to remember that SACC started what was in the old trolley barn in Schenectady, which had become the J.M. Fields building. J.M. Fields had left, and TCI, the cable company, had started to have a head end at that point. That was the origination point for the cable in the city of Schenectady. And that's where SACC began. It was really the genesis in Schenectady of a woman by the name of Stephanie Stewart, a very energetic woman who worked for TCI, and then when TCI moved out and merged with Time Warner, she then wrote a job description for a coordinator for the public access channel. And she wrote a job description, she sold the idea, and TCI hired her as the coordinator for SACC. So SACC was the not-for-profit corporation that was supporting and using the channel. Stephanie Stewart became the sort of director and facilitator. She was employed by the cable company, but she saw her job description to be coordinating public access. And so that's how public access really began. We started out with a few shows. We started with what they call bicycle tapes, which are tapes made by different people in different communities and then mailed into Schenectady. We would play the show and mail it back, and we would do the same with others. We also started local content. SACC raised some money. We were given some small amount of money each year by the cable company as a piece of the monthly fee that subscribers paid to the cable company. And every time the cable contract was negotiated, a piece of that or that sum was given to the purpose of public access in all of its forms. Part of that budget would be to buy equipment. Part of the budget would be to pay the salary of Stephanie Stewart. Later, Prim Oliver and Gary Delane became involved, both extremely important to the organization in terms of its future and its growth. Gary was much more the technical person. Prim was the person who was involved in keeping the SACC organization going. And there came a time when we had, I'd say upwards of 80 to 100 members, all paying a small amount of dues, but having membership meetings and having a very lively community-involved programming effect in the city of Schenectady. We were much further ahead than Albany and Troy, and the reason for it was the job that Stephanie Stewart got the cable company to fund. Having a full-time employee who was responsible for shepherding SACC, for shepherding Channel 16, for helping it and helping the people who came in find direction, to organize themselves, to find training, to set up workshops, to be there each day, to be able to answer the phone, direct people. That made a huge difference. And that was a function of the cable company and its ability to fund that position. And as long as that position was funded, it was a tremendous help to Schenectady Access Cable Council, which always stayed on the side. We were not part of the cable company, but it was a little not-for-profit operating in the city of Schenectady.
What have you learned of the importance of having public access available in a community like Schenectady?
Well, public access, as I see it, forms a bridge between the period of time in the early 70s when the cable became available and today when YouTube is very ubiquitous. At the time when Schenectady Access Cable Council arose, there was no way for anyone in a community to get anything other than broadcast TV. You just couldn't do it. You didn't have the training, didn't have the equipment, didn't have the studio, didn't have the personnel. You just couldn't have a TV show or being on or able to be on the TV in any fashion. Having something like public access TV gave the community an outlet. It always suffered from the problem that it was and was basically populated by people who were beginning to learn. It wasn't populated by professionals. Professionals went to work in the industry. This was for people who were just beginning, people who were learning. So it suffered in the way, and the quality suffered. It was always the beginning. And our equipment in the very beginning was, for instance, we started with black and white. Well, I mean, that's what we could afford at that time. No, I mean, if you look at black and white versus color, I mean, color is much more attractive. Now we have high definition cameras that will sit in the palm of your hand. But in those days, a black and white TV camera, we were lucky not to have the big studio cameras. We thought it was wonderful to have a camera that was about 2.5 feet long, about, well, maybe 6 or 12 inches thick and about 12 inches high. And we thought that was a tremendously portable camera, which it was compared to the very large studio cameras of that day. Nowadays, it isn't quite as important. If somebody said today, is it possible for somebody to get a message out in a TV methodology or in a video? The answer would be sure. Take a video, put it on YouTube, and the entire world can see it, rather than just limiting it to Channel 16 in the city of Schenectady. But what the channel does provide, and what SACC does provide, is a place where people in the community can organize around. You can have a studio. You can have a place where people can learn to operate the equipment. It's one thing to take a video and then upload it from your computer. It's another thing to learn about time syncing, another thing to learn about editing. And in order to do that and provide that platform, one of the missions of SACC was to provide a place where people in the city could learn about the art of TV, could learn about the production of TV without having to pay for it. In other words, it would be essentially a free service for the residents of the city of Schenectady. And plus, it would be a place where people could come and teach each other. And in that, SACC provided a unique function, and still does. It's a teaching opportunity, and in that respect, SACC will never need to go out of business. People can always learn how to have better public speaking. People can always learn how to have effective coverage. And so you can say, fine, we can take a video, but now that once you have some raw video, how do you edit it? What's an editing studio? How can we bring in special effects? How can we have overlays? How can we have credits? All those things are the beginning of production TV. And SACC was and is a facilitator for people who want to learn how to do and how to begin in that industry. Now, some people want to be talent. Some people wanted to be behind the scenes. We had people who didn't want to be on the front of the camera ever. They wanted to learn how to operate special effects. They wanted to learn how to sync. Well, in those days, it was a big deal to sync things. Now I think it happens much more automatically. But in those days, that was pretty tough. And you had a signal generator. How could you get text onto the TV? Now you say, well, just put it up, right? But in those days, it had to be done. It was a much greater effort to get something like that done. And to operate the head end. Another big stage or big change was when they added, Time Warner added a head end, a second head end, down at City Hall. And now we can have origination from City Hall. And so SACC began with the prospect of broadcasting the city council meetings so that the people in the city of Schenectady could see what the legislators are doing. It's always interesting to me that they always try to resist more TV, and they don't want the committee meetings, they're trying to resist that. On the other hand, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the people to see and hear what the people who are supposedly working for us are doing. The very first equipment was cast-off equipment from TCI. TCI had some equipment of theirs, and they basically donated those first cameras to SACC. Then SACC used a budget that we got from TCI, and we purchased some additional equipment of our own. The very first equipment was cast-offs, secondhand stuff from TCI.
How did you guys learn, or how did you learn how to use the equipment?
By trial and error. It was, we would go and ask some of the techs at TCI how to use it, and then it was a lot of self-learning. In those days, this is right around 1976 or so, there weren't any schools except very expensive ones to learn about broadcasting, but then they were using the big equipment. These were the newer, small in those days, small for the industry cameras. And so we basically learned them from the manuals.
What were the very first shows?
The very first shows were shows on things like cooking, Schenectady Reports. We had Electric City Forum. That was a SACC show. Our first show that I remember was Electric City Forum. That was the first SACC show. See, the beauty of SACC was that anybody could make a show. If you wanted to come in and have a show about your family, you could come in and make the show. All you had to do was find somebody who was SACC trained to operate the camera and somebody to sit in front of it. And that's really all you needed, because it went on a tape, and the videotape went in the back, we plugged it in, and we played it.
Were there any times where things went wrong?
Oh, sure. Sure, cameras didn't work. You know, somebody would shine one at a light bulb, and you'd knock out the sensor for a while. In the beginning, the cameras were very sensitive. We used to have things called white balance, which I don't think people do anymore, but in those days we had to white balance your sensors in the cameras. They were much more sensitive to the amount of light, so that if you didn't have a lot of light, you were in trouble. We used to have much brighter lights in the studios because the cameras were not as sensitive. The cameras couldn't operate in low light situations.
The vision that you had originally for SACC way back in '74, you feel you achieved that?
Oh yes, clearly. In the next 15 and 20 years from 74, 84, 94, that period of time, SACC did what it was supposed to do. It provided a spot for people to come in who were interested in TV to get into the methodology and the production of television programs on a local basis. If you wanted to learn, SACC was available, equipment was available for you to learn. There was showtime. You could get your show on. You could edit it if you wanted to learn. But in order to do that, you had to learn how to use the editing deck. And so we had 4 or 5 people who would give classes to learn how to use the editing deck, because the editing deck was how you added special effects or intros or a wipe. Now you can do a wipe on the computer very easy from one frame to another. But in those days, you had to play it and then bring in that special effect and edit that into the tape, because we were always working on tapes. We weren't working on digital files.
How many years was there public access in other areas of the country before SACC?
I don't believe it was really before SACC. That period of time, 1970s, is when the cable companies started going national and they started having state regulation. And it was the state regulations which caused the cable companies to negotiate this idea of public access. In the negotiation of essentially a franchise to a cable company. The cable company wanted to negotiate a contract. And what would happen is the cable company would never institute public access on its own. That was something that was imposed on it in the bargaining chips by, in the beginning, the New York State government. And later on, it was incorporated into the individual contracts that the cable companies negotiated with the individual cities and towns. But initially, in the very beginning, they thought that the state regulators would be something similar to the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. And how the FCC regulated the broadcasters, people thought, well, there's going to be a state agency regulating the cable companies. And for a short number of years, they did. Then, basically, the state stepped out of the issue, and the cable companies negotiated directly with the cities and towns.
So was SACC the first public access?
I don't believe it was the first in the entire country, but it was the first. I think it was second. There was, in New York State, it was second. There was one in New York City, which had been also a result of a contract with the city of New York, and we were number 2.
That would be Manhattan Cable?
Yes.
They were
Yeah, they existed when we started. I believe we were number 2.
So did you learn a lot by getting into film or television? Basically, it was trial and error, and it basically formed into the direction. Was it a planned direction, or was it just like trial and error? And it was
Trial and error. No one knew what to do. No one knew what SACC could do. No one knew what public access was capable of doing. Nobody knew whether or not it could be a regular programming. Nobody knew what we would do, how we would handle the issue when there were more people who wanted programs that we had time for. Right? Would there be a second channel? As it turned out, there was always extra time available because there were, for instance, there was a government and an educational channel that never got used. The only channel in the beginning of the 4 channels that were set out available for the government, the public access channel, the educational channel, and the government channel, the only one that ever got used was channel 16, the public access channel. Why? Because of SACC. Because there was a group of volunteers, an organized group, pushing and organizing shows and learning. And it's that push and that beginning, that groundswell and that group of people that gave rise to Channel 16's use. Channel 16 is provided by the cable company. They just say, here's the head end. Here's a cable ending. Here's a channel. You have 24 hours, 7 days a week. Go for it. And that's all that they're going to do. And so the provision, what you connect to that cable, how you generate the shows, what do you do in the days, in the time when there is no show. We used to have a wheel. Oh, how far back we go. In the time when there wasn't a show on the air, you wanted something to be on the channel so that you just wouldn't see white noise. So we had a big wheel, a physical wheel, and we had 3x5 cards. And you would type on the card what you wanted on the wheel, and the wheel would rotate, dip, 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 in front of a camera. And we had a black and white camera staring at the wheel, and so you would see one card, and it would wait 5 seconds. The next card would come up in the wheel, and that's how we had shows or announcements of shows on a large wheel, rotating, physically rotating in the studio. Now that's kind of silly at this point in time. People will laugh about it and chuckle, but at that time, that's how we did it.
Do you have any suggestions for, after all what you've seen, for the future of cable TV? Do you have anything that you might suggest for the growth?
Yeah, my suggestion would be that it's always difficult because we're always taking people in at the beginning level. That's the nature of the beast. And so the best thing, my suggestion would be to try to improve the entry pathway for people. In the same way that you can see videos online, for instance, about how to make things, I think having a set of shows or a set of materials so that people can self-teach in learning how, A, to use equipment, how to use signal generators, how to do editing, so that people can self-learn. Lots of what we discovered was the hardest thing was to try to get people in for classes. So what SACC can do for the future to make it easier is to build up the library of materials so that when somebody shows an interest, they can come in and we can say, okay, here's a library of 15 hours of material. Have a seat, take a shot at this. And then we can review after you've had a chance to look at 2 or 3 hours of material.
What's the future of television? Where's it going?
Onto the net. I mean, eventually, television will merge as a digital file with any other file that you watch. Right now, the files that we watch, people say, well, there's still broadcast quality tape, there's still 2-inch tape, and in some cases there is tape. It does exist, but for the most part, the digital file will eventually push out the tape. So what's the difference between watching a digital file on your television and or watching it being broadcast? And the short answer is none. Right now, people are watching TV on their computer screens. There's been a merge between the output, the screen definition now when we say, oh, do you have high definition? Do you have HD? That originally started as a computer screen. And digital output is now accepted as a reasonable way for television to function. So digital cameras, digital file, digital streaming. I mean, you have to remember there are no more movies, there is no more film in the movie house. The movie houses this year are all going digital. So they will receive a CD or a DVD and they'll play that. So it's a digital file. So the world is going digital, which will mean, in my opinion, a merger between internet and television. So it's the production. Say, okay, what's the future? Better and more portable, less weight, less effort to make high quality digital shows. And since that's the future, then for SACC, what SACC can do is to facilitate that. And to facilitate it is to give people an opportunity for the editing, because that is a skill that people have to learn, and camera work and setup and set design is a skill, and also being in front of the camera. That's also, in some senses, a skill. Some people are very afraid of it.
Carla, in 92, I was asked by the committee for the Colonial Festival to go on your radio show that at the time you had. Mm-hmm. And the next thing I know, you asked me to come on a public access show. Mm-hmm. I had no idea what Channel 16 was and said, yeah, sure, Valentine, I've something read like you wanted, and I'll be on your show. So that was my introduction to SACC at the time. Mm-hmm, and the funny thing was, a couple of days later, I was at the Price Chopper on Eastern Parkway, and I thought, people are watching me. The funny feeling, and people are talking. I had the feeling they were talking. I come around the aisle, and there was a woman standing and said, were you on Carla Page's show? And I said, yeah. But I realized after having been on your show that you were one of the most watched shows that I ever knew about at the time, because people said, saw you on Carla Page. Yeah. So that was my introduction to SACC. Mm. And what I learned is that you, Carla, you were the embodiment of the spirit of public access. I was so impressed by public access, a voice for everyone. And you brought the community to SACC. You brought people from all walks of life. And that you are still doing, Carla. You're still doing. But How did you get involved with SACC?
Wow, thanks for chatting with me. I mean that, and I love you. You know that, and I've been loving being on Channel 16 since 1978. I know, a long time.
Wow.
Ruth Fonda used to say that I was the Band-Aid that held together Channel 16, and she's now deceased. And I always remember those words. And thank you for your kind words too. And I've always been in show business, a singer, performer, and always loved people, but an only child. So I like the fact of being able to communicate with people. And I remember as a little girl saying to my mother and my father that I was a proper child. Where did I get that from? I just said it. I said, I'm a proper child. I was always inquisitive, though, Anneke. I always used to ask a lot of questions. So this was just like a natural, perfect thing for me to be, someone that would interview people. But a man named Joe Bowman actually brought me aboard Channel 16, and he is now a professor, so he is Dr. Bowman now. And we were on McClellan Street at the time, right over in front of the where the Price Chopper is. And it's interesting because my first camera people were women, 2 black women. Sarah Hill, who is now the marketing,
yes.
she's the marketing manager of
Yes.
Procter. She was one of my first camera people.
That's amazing.
And then I had a girl named Lynn Harvey who was doing very well for herself. She lives in the South, and she was there too as a camera person. And so you figure 2 black women, and I'm the host and the producer. And then we had Dave Filano, who was our director. And we just had a ball back then. But we were in black and white. And we used to use a 1/2-inch reel-to-reel when we first started. And we started out on McClellan Street. And from McClellan Street, we went over to
Bigelow?
No, to Kings Road and that school there, the elementary school. We were in that
Okay.
building for a long time. That's actually where the Fondas were. But when I was on McClellan Street, I worked with Prim Oliver. Some of these names maybe you
Right,
don't recognize,
right.
but
Prim I do.
from 1978, you figured it was Prim Oliver. I worked with, a woman named Robin, Jim Chessing, John Hughes, Alan G., Dave's brother Mike, and the Fondas, Ruth Fonda, Clark Fonda. And it was just an experience that I will never, ever forget. Let me tell you something, Anneke. There is not a day, and I'm saying this without an ego, no ego here at all, but there is not a day that goes by that people do not come up to me and say,
I do believe that.
aren't you the lady that's on
absolutely-
TV? Or I watch you on TV,
I-
Carla, or just, hi, Carla, because every time I would do a show, I would always end my program with, when you see me out there in the community, say hi. And by
They
golly,
did.
the
They
people would
did.
do it. They would
Yes.
do it. They would
People-
do it. They would
people
do it.
did.
They
Yeah.
would do that. So, and my programs, for me, were always multicultural because I wanted to reach every culture. I wanted to be able to reach, like you say, every walk of life. I would have people on my shows that a lot of times had never been on television before, but would come on and be great. They'd be awesome.
And next thing you know, you had them doing their own
That's
shows.
right. I brought so many people
You
aboard.
you
I did, and I took a lot of
brought
pride in that, in bringing people aboard and saying, "Hey, you know what? You'd be good doing your own TV show. You ever think about doing TV?" So that there really was so dear to my heart to be able to bring people. And again, like I was saying to you earlier before we started filming, it always was a family. And I would say to people when I'd bring them aboard to Channel 16, I'd say, "Welcome to the family." Welcome. We were a family, and my programs were inspiring, Anneke. I always took a lot of hard work in getting information and plus entertaining. You know what I mean? And I want to just take a minute, if I may, to thank everyone for has supported me over the years from 1978 till now. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being supportive of me. And letting a girl that's homegrown be able to flourish and be able to follow her dream, and to be able to be a role model. And I thank you. I thank you, Schenectady.
But Carla, the reason that people do come up to you and greet you, because when you watch one of your shows, your heart comes right through that screen.
Yes.
So
It does.
and that's what I think people people embrace in you, and you still you're back on the air.
I'm back on the air.
It's so
back
good
on the air, sure.
and with the people you choose, very very interesting, sort of the known quantities that but then you bring in for example, what impressed me really was the person. She was originally, I believe, from Jamaica, and was I forgot her name, but she teaches currently Spanish at the high school.
Oh yes, that was that just recently ran, that show you're talking about, or from years ago?
No, that recently
Oh, that was
ran.
Dr. Chang. Dr. Chang.
Yeah, so
Yes.
it's so very very interesting. But those were also then the days of when you started then in 78 of the Porta Pack. When you read our incorporation papers,
I know it.
you say
I
the
know
mission of
Yes,
SACC
yes,
was
that's right.
to help people
Yes.
produce programs
That's right.
for public
That's right.
access.
That's right.
And then it mentions training on the Porta Pack.
That's
and
right. That's
I
what it
heard
was.
stories, people on their
Yes.
bicycles
Yes.
with the thing on
Porta
the
Packs. So
with
true.
with the
So-
Porta
And just the
Pack.
fact of being in black and white. I mean, not even being in color yet. And you speak about me, about my heart being in my shows. My mother and father always said to me, you wear your heart on your sleeve, Carla. So it coincides with what you're saying. But it's interesting because I would always say to people, Anneke, I'd say, or if I'd speak, because I do a lot of outreach and speak at a lot of places, and I would say, I look out at the audience and I'd say, I've had either you on my show, either someone in your family, your coworker, your neighbor, someone from your church. I've had somebody that I know that I've had them at one time or another on my show as a guest. And it was always easy to get guests. That's another thing. People want to always to come and talk to me because they could trust me. And they knew that my shows were of integrity and honor and grace, and I wouldn't just have just any old thing on my shows. And the thing about it is people would say public access, but that to me, I didn't think of it as that. I would think of it as, this is my television show. This is my show. And I would always have wonderful people. I mean, I have politicians on, the clergy. I mean, again, all walks of life. And they wanted to, people never said no to me. And even to this day that I'm on the air now, because I went to the New School of Contemporary Radio. I graduated in 1988 from there. But I had already been on television for 10 years before I even got my FCC license. So I do have an FCC license, but, I did radio for years. That's how, we met when I was on the radio.
Yeah.
But I never had a problem getting and finding guests. Never. And still to this day, I don't.
Well, my next contact with you came then in what was it, 98, I believe, and that was with the telethons that
Yes.
because by then the city had given SACC the franchise, and we became at that point SACC TV, and when you were talking about family, I know how everybody was there like a family and having such a good
Yes.
time
Isn't that the truth?
with the telethons, and they were live.
They were live. Actually, the year was 1999, and the first one, I was the executive producer of 2 telethons. The first was called The Labor of Love, and that was 28 hours long, and we went all night long, and I got the guests. And what I would do is as you remember, I would ask the other hosts to come in and take a segment of the telethon and host it. Shelley was one, you were one, Frank Ducey, our former mayor, so many different people, Dolores Scalise, Ann Parillo, so many people. I would have them, and if there's someone I forgot, forgive me, please, but we would do this as a joint effort because I've always wanted to do a telethon for Channel 16. So the first one was called Labor of Love, and the second one was in 2000, and that was called Unconditional Love. And that one we broke up into 3 different days over the weekend, still adding up to 28 hours, but it was in in days instead of all night like the first one. Raised a lot of money. And that's another thing I want to say, if you don't mind. Thank you, everyone involved in those telethons. If I didn't get, and I went out all the way big thanking everyone, but if there's someone I did not thank, I want to take the time to thank you now. I mean, people like all the people that were my camera crew. I want to thank, again, the different hosts, the talent that performed all throughout the night, businesses who helped us, and restaurants who provided food and drinks for us, the politicians, the clergy that came. I mean, I remember Mayor Al Drzezinski came and opened up the telethon the first year, 1999. I'll never forget it, you know. So, I mean, anyone who donated to the telethon, thank you, thank you, thank you. I mean that. This is a show of, so, you know, for me, you know, you asking me to come on and talk about the history, but for me, when I think of Channel 16, I can only think of people and gratitude and being thankful, and the love that's out in this community is amazing. People don't really realize it until you do hands-on. When you do hands-on, then you know there's a lot of love in this community, despite what people try to say. Another thing, you know, there'd be times years ago, and I have to say this because sometimes it was comical. We'd have some technical difficulties, audio difficulties, but you know what? The show went on. I never stopped. And then the very next week, I was right back there doing another show. So I didn't let things like that stop me because of technical difficulties, audio, or anything that would happen. I still was consistent and persistent because I knew that I was being a role model for people, and just the fact of knowing that people were being touched by what I was doing. And that's what it's about, is being touched by what I was doing. And I can be so satisfied in my spirit that I was right before the city council meetings. I mean, I've had different names of my show. My first started off, my show was called Carla Page Presents. Then I changed it to the Carla Page Show. Okay? And I would be on right before city council. So tell me that's not a segue right there. City council, then Carla. I mean, really, you know, we had the viewers.
And then, really, on Broadway, it became the
Schenectady Today Show
and
that I hosted that. That's
and
right.
your day was Tuesday, I believe.
I did different ones.
You
I
did
different
ones,
Yeah,
I
but I
think.
did that for many years too. The
And-
Schenectady Today Show.
Yeah, and talking about family, I know with Dolores, yeah,
Oh,
I had a
yes.
call about a show, and it was basically, actually, it was Vince Riggy, and he met Cermak from the Times Union at the time, gives me a call and said, Vince really would like to be on the show, but the only day he has is Tuesday, which was Dolores or sometimes you.
Me. That's right, because sometimes we would alternate.
Yeah,
That's right.
but then no problem, you know, because Dolores and you said, oh, we
Yes,
can have our
yes.
guests another
Yes.
time. Good to hear from somebody different.
Yes.
Yeah, so that was,
Yes.
Dolores and you made room for
We
Vince
did.
Ricky.
We did. We
so-
always, and that's another thing we used to do is like a lot of times I'd call Ann or Dolores, and I'd say, or some of the gentlemen that were there. I'm like, I've got this guest, and my show is packed. Can you fit them in on one of your shows? You know, like next week or the week after, and we would like bounce guests around too, which were really good. What I mean by that is we would be able to still be able to never say no to someone that, especially if they needed to get some publicity out. You know what I mean? So never say no to them, but still just another person would be interviewing them. And I have to say this too, okay, Anneke, being a host is wonderful and I love it, but producing the show, being a producer is very fulfilling to me too. Planning the show, the meat of the show, is very fulfilling. Being able to get the guests and plan and write the questions and do all that, that's so fulfilling too. And if there's anyone out there who has an interest in being on television, contact SACC. Let them know that you want to be on television. It doesn't matter about your age or your background. Let them know you want to be heard too. And they'll help you do a show. Don't be shy, don't hold back. You've got something important to say. Please, look at us. Years, right?
If you want to do a show, we had a lawyer who was very interested in Veterans Affairs and would give advice for seniors and veterans. So when I look back, I think it was as good as any.
Yes. I do remember when I first began that the key was, they were saying, is to be prepared, be ready, come down there knowing what you want to do for your show, because I've done half-hour shows and then I've done hour shows. So the thing is to know what you want to do from start to finish. You know, get yourself your titles together, the music you want for your show further. And that was the fun part too, is, you know, what kind of music do I want for my introduction? The Schenectady Today show, of course, they had their own music, but when I would do my own program, I had to get my own. But that, just the fact of being prepared it made it so much. You have to just know what you want to do ahead. It makes it simpler for the crew and for everyone involved. It really does.
But there was a handbook.
Mm-hmm.
There was a handbook. I think Ann Parillo made that handbook, and it told you what not to wear and how you would look best. And I think we have to dig that up, because that was really very informative.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would have to produce, you know, the day schedule.
That's right.
First guest, second guest,
Yes,
you know, your
sure.
break tapes and so on. So it was not that people just, you know, came in from the cold, so to speak, but
no.
there was the opportunity to learn how to go ahead
And
with
then
the show.
where else could you go to really learn hands-on how to run a camera, how to do, you know, because we've had some people, I remember in the early days, one woman was at she was over with us at Channel 16. She went on to work at Channel 13 for a while. I myself worked at Channel 10. Even I worked at Channel 10 from 79 to 83. But the thing about it is, where else could you learn how to do all this equipment? It's the most valuable stuff imaginable. And once you have it in your head, it never goes away. So I suggest that if a person does want to do a show, be prepared and talk things out with the camera people. Know what you want to do, and the sky's the limit. There's nothing that you can't do, honestly.
Talking about history, I mean, in the 90s then, that was a volunteer crew, and people were trained.
They were trained.
They were trained to do the filming, to do the audio, and Bettina Rouse.
Oh, I was going to say, oh yes, I love her.
Bettina Rouse.
Mother Rouse. She stayed with me during the telethon, the first one I did, all night long. Yes.
And
yes.
yeah, and
Lovely person.
I
Another
always
person.
thought,
Serious.
You know, that was the most Christian, generic Christian, let's say,
she was
to get out.
awesome,
Yeah,
awesome person.
and she would come. I remember her distinctly. But there, she had a volunteer crew as well, and did her. That the opportunity for people to have the thought that if they truly, truly want to get a message out and are passionate about getting that message out,
That's right.
there is public access, and SACC is here, and there is nothing more democratic, in my opinion, than to be able to have a voice for everyone who wants to have one.
Yes, yes.
What was the original vision of public access?
Well, the original vision of public access was to create an environment for the community to come and have a piece of their mission or their organization and put it out on television, where they would have more than just a little sound bite. They could come in and do an entire show on, say, adoptions, or on child care, or on cancer, or on political things going on. Very important for people to talk about these issues and get their voice out there.
How was SACC first formed?
Well, SACC was formed, I believe, before my time, was around 1974. I believe the corporation started. And at that time, had just been that there was going to be public access in the government, said that it was allowable. So what happened is that it was formed, and that Gary Delane, I believe, and a number of other, Jim Lewis, and there were a number of people that were farsighted enough to go ahead and formed this corporation. Even though they didn't have a station at the time, they had the vision, and that's really what was behind public access at that time. And it wasn't, and actually, SACC did help TCI and Time Warner before that, and it wasn't until about 1996 that they purchased a building. And then at 115 North Broadway, where actually you'll see Habitat for Humanity, that was the SACC building. It was a building that comprised, I believe, 3 buildings. There are 3 basements. We had 3 studios. We had 2 master controls. We really developed a beautiful area, and in one of our studios, we actually had 3 or 4 studios. So it was really great.
What are some of the memories you have of SACC and some of the shows that stand out?
Oh, that's interesting. Some of the shows that stand out. Well, first of all, since SACC had no control over shows except for one show, and that was the Schenectady Today show that was started back in 1998. There were a lot of shows on. There were Melinda's Penthouse, which was really a fun show. A couple of guys did a great show there. There's been Green Talk, which has been around a long time. Media Zone has been around a long time. Although they filmed in their own studio, they brought their shows to SACC and other areas as well. Jana Sings, she's been doing that show for a long time too. I think what's exciting about the local content, because we have a lot of content that is beyond local, but the local content is the enthusiasm that people put into the shows that they did. And they were able to get volunteers to come in and help, and it made it like almost a party.
Why did you get involved with SACC?
Well, one day, I was watching TV, and I'm trying to remember who it was, but somebody got on television and said, maybe it was Gary Delane, and he said, we really need help. We've got this public access station, and we've got a new building, and we need volunteers. And at that time, I said, gee, I think that was like in '96, and I thought, gee, that sounds like a really interesting thing to do. And so Greg Millett and myself, we went down there, and we joined in and found a building that was an absolute wreck, but it was a great building, and we saw the vision, and we thought that would be kind of fun to get involved, which we did, and we ended up being on the board and actually doing things like taking ice scrapers and scooping up the floors and cleaning and nailing new molding down. I mean, it was just an incredible thing that we did, but it was a great place.
Do you think that, how would things be different if there was no SACC? Would the community be different? Would the, I'm trying to get this right. How has SACC affected the community for the good? And what would the community have lost out if SACC never existed?
That's your question is a good one. It actually points what would our community be like if there was no public access. Well, we certainly wouldn't have any voice. We wouldn't have the voice that we have. We would not be giving the voice to the community, in a sense that we have someone who will decide to do a show and then they interview people. And that's what brings the voice, is bringing people onto the show where they might not be able to do a full half-hour show. They would certainly be happy to be a guest on the show and talk about what's going on in their community. Perhaps it's trying to get more people to volunteer at one of the museums, or perhaps it just means that some of the nonprofits would go under if they didn't have volunteers to help. This is what's important, I believe, for the voice of the community. What would happen if it wasn't there? Well, they'd be using the newspaper maybe, and maybe that voice would not be heard. It wouldn't give as large of a voice to the people, and that's why I believe firmly in public access. They only have, they have one studio, which is called the Soapbox Studio, the Black Box Studio, and they do quite a few shows in there. There's not a lot of flexibility because there's only 2 people sitting there, but still people can get their message out. It's certainly available to people, and I know that they're doing it.
In your opinion, What changes would you make if you had the power to do so for public access in Schenectady? What would you do differently?
What changes would I make if I had the power to change public access? I'm not sure that we have, SACC, of course, is doing productions. We have Open Stage Media doing productions. I think the venues are there for people to use. They have to take the initiative. They have to go to SACC or they have to go to Open Stage Media. They have to say, this is what I want to do. Can you help me? Or can you show me how to do it? And I think in both cases that it will happen. And there's room for everything.
If SACC had stayed at Broadway and was going in the way it was going, as opposed to where it is today with OSM, which would you rather? Which would you think? What do you think is a better scenario? The original scenario where it was going, or the new scenario?
They're different. Yeah, they're different. Right? It's hard to say.
So how would it be different if it stayed at Broadway? How would things be different?
Well, it would have built on what we already had there. I mean, things would have just kept building.
Were they going in the right direction?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I think that the difference is that when it moved to a new location, it was like a new startup. I mean, they had to set everything up again, whereas everything was all set in one location. And you can't argue with what the city decided. I mean, I had no control over that. I don't think anybody had any real control over it. It was the city council that made that decision.
Has a protocol changed, or has the way things are, especially for the public, is it easier or is it harder for somebody to use Open Stage Media than it was before? I mean, to come in to do a show there, and the cost factor, or
I don't know anything about the cost factor, so I can't really comment on that. How easy it is, all I know is that I do one show, and we've been doing it there for now 2 years, a little over 2 years, and it takes us about an hour to set up, and we do the show and we break it down, and that's it. There's no real studio where we are. We have to put it together, but the Black Box studio is all set up so that anybody could walk in there and do that. They're two different things.
Were you at the Kings Road facility at all?
Oh yeah, Kings Road. Well, that was when it was under TCI. And at that time, I had no knowledge really of public access at that time. I believe I was teaching at the College of Pharmacy at the time, and we were doing a 6-part series with dermatologists and pharmacists. Were doing a series on skin cancer, and it was a 6-part thing, and we did it there because we had a studio there to do it. And I was not aware of public access at the time. I didn't know, but we were able to put together a show, which was really a lot of fun, and I thought, oh, this is exciting. And then from there, I believe they went over to Bigelow. They moved when Time Warner moved it over to Bigelow, and public access was run out of Bigelow by Time Warner, who had the studio and everything, although I believe SACC was involved in some ancillary way. I'm really not sure because that was before my time. And at that time, I was doing a show there with Singles Outreach Services, and it was called Singles Talk, and we did that quite a bit there until it moved over. That Time Warner said, no more, we don't want to do it. We're just abandoning public access. SACC, do it. And they did. They bought the building and they set it up, and then they did it from 1996 roughly till 2000.
Do you have any memories of Ruth and Clark Fonda or Christine Crewell?
No, I don't know either one of those. Those were before my time.
Christine came in at the end of, before the move to Bigelow.
I think Christine worked for us for a short time, because at that time, this is an interesting part of history. Once we were in the building, we had problems with the building, so we didn't have a certificate of occupancy, but we had all the equipment to transmit. So what were we going to do? So it was St. John the Baptist Church that allowed us to put a little studio, not a studio, but a transmitting area into their rectory. And I believe Christine was working with us at that time, and I know that she may have been part of getting it set up, but that was like for a very short time. You jogged my memory.
Okay. What are some of, your most memorable, favorite moments of doing your show?
Oh my goodness, so many.
Do you have some things you can share?
So many, yeah. We used to do the show in the window, the front window. And of course, the train would go by, and one of the challenges, which, I mean, I'm sitting in your studio here. I mean, you have the lighting is all the same, but we were looking at outdoor lighting coming in through the window and fluorescent lighting. So the white balance would be going, and your one camera would be kind of have a bluish tint, and another one. So those were some of the problems with that. But the exciting part was that most of our shows were four segments, and it wasn't just me, but there were other people doing shows as well. And we could actually start our show in the window, and then I'd have a band set up in Studio B, and then I'd say, okay, we're going to take a quick break, and you'll find me. And I'd run into the other studio, and we did all of this live. There was no editing. We did everything live. That's exciting when you're doing a live TV. It just kind of gets your juices going when you do that. You never know what's going to happen, and it probably did.
Did you ever have any frustrating moments or times that you wanted to give up?
Never.
What do you think Schenectady? What kind of shows do you think Schenectady would benefit from? Like new shows?
Yeah, new shows. I think that there are so many organizations in our community that, like the United Way, could take a show and feature different nonprofits. You could get like Metroplex to come up with doing the Erie Boulevard over. I mean, there's so many things going on that they could come up and do a full half hour on. Maybe not every week, but maybe once a month. You have the Chamber of Commerce could do something. You have the city council. Well, they do the city council is taped, but there may be issues that they could sit down and talk to perhaps some of the citizenry to sit down and chat about this. What about a certain park? What do you think needs to be done there? And bring 2 or 3 citizens in and talk about that. It's kind of like opening a window and letting fresh air in when you can get this information out.
Do you have any suggestions on how we can help Schenectady in its current troubles?
You mean financial?
Yeah, any area you want to address that you might have some opinions on?
I think it's just a voice getting the information out is all I see, one of the things that's happening with public access, and I belong to the Alliance for Community Media. One of the things you're finding is that as people abandon cable, maybe they go to satellite TV. If satellite is not carrying cable, and some of it is, some of this program is going to be lost. I think part of it has to be that we get out there, do the programming, get it onto the internet, maybe distribute some of the shows to the library for people to check out. There has to be other ways of getting it, because now people are using Androids, they're using their cell phones to watch TV. So are they getting, they're not getting public access, because public access is really only given by the cable company. Now, I understand FiOS is now carrying the cable TV show. But, there's so many new things happening electronically that we don't know where this is going to go. And I think the important thing is to stay ahead of the curve if we can, and try and anticipate what's going to happen and see how we can get our information out to people.